Hey, everybody, welcome to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zaran. Thank you, as always, for joining me for another edition of the podcast. This week, I want to get into some college football, mainly because there's been one team that's kind of been in the crosshairs of a lot of the college football media lately, and that's the Indiana Hoosiers. So, if you aren't familiar, the Hoosiers are in the midst of having the best season they've ever had. They have won over 10 games, have won 10 games. They just lost to Ohio State in convincing fashion, unfortunately for them. And they only have one loss, right? So you would think Big Ten team, one loss to a really good opponent. Sounds like they should be a cinch to get into this expanded 12-team playoff. But it's not exactly been the case of what's been going on. We've seen a lot of conversation about they're undeserving, they haven't really played anybody, that, a 2 or even a 3 loss team from the SEC or even a 2 loss team from the Big 12 are a little bit more deserving. And it really got me to thinking about the overall problem with college football, in the sense of there's this gap of this handful of elite teams and everybody else, and the way we perceive those teams versus the less reputable, say, of the schools that are out there. And it also got me thinking about college basketball and the way we view teams in college basketball versus college football. So, a lot to get to. So, let's just dive right in. First of all, let's talk about the way we look at college basketball selection for their tournament versus college football. First, a couple numbers. So there's 352 schools that play Division I college basketball that are eligible to make the tournament every year. 68 of them make the tournament, obviously the final field of 64 and the first four play-in that happens in Dayton, Ohio before that. So that equates to 19.3% of schools making the tournament, which is a good amount. Almost 1/5. 1 in 5 schools will make the tournament. So that's the way it is in basketball. Now, in football, there's 128 Division I FBS schools. Obviously, the FCS is a separate thing, and they have their playoff system. 12 of those teams now, starting this year, are making the playoff, which means 9.3% of schools make the playoff. So that's a big drop-off from what we see in college basketball. So let's say, for example, you wanted to move the playoff to 16 teams to create a little bit more equity there. That would still only be 12.5% of the field. The only way you really get it close to the parity of basketball is if you had 24 teams. 24 teams with a bunch of byes in the first round, that gets you to about 20%, which is the equivalent of basketball. The reason I bring up those numbers is that a lot of times when a school from like the ACC in basketball has a bunch of losses, they're just barely over 500 and they don't make the tournament, those fans are disappointed, and you hear some people argue about it. But ultimately, what you don't have to deal with is people saying, well, I can't believe this school from the Atlantic 10 made it in over them, because it's just it's a talking point for a day, and then the tournament starts, March Madness starts, and nobody cares anymore. In football, we're having these mental gymnastics exercises over worth. Who's worthy? What team deserves it? Who should be able to get in versus who shouldn't be able to get in? And I find it incredibly fascinating, and I think the core start of that issue is really this perception, right? For so long, we're going to get to this a little bit later, but there's this idea in football of we have to crown the right champion. Whereas basketball has kind of taken the approach of this is crazy, that's why it's called March Madness. Anything can happen, right? And I think that's colored the way we approach this stuff, because so right now everybody's talking about strength of schedule, resume, signature wins, that sort of thing. In football, you don't really have that in basketball. Basketball also has more games, which is, a basketball season has 32, 33 games. The football season only has 12 or 13, 14 if you're in the conference championship. So that limited sample size also kind of colors the way we kind of look at it. But the bigger thing, I think, is that there's a disparity in the way that schedules are happening, even within the same conference. Again, with the comparison to basketball. In basketball, you're playing every single team in the conference at least once, right? So there is no situation where, well, I didn't get Oregon this year, or I didn't get this team this year, like it is in football, right? Because the conferences now, especially in the Power Four conferences, they've gotten so large, 18-team conferences. You're not playing 17 regular season games, so there's no way you're playing every single team in the conference. So a lot of times what happens, you have an Indiana who ends up playing really none of the big name teams in the Big Ten this year. They don't play Oregon. They don't play Penn State. They played Ohio State but lost. They don't play Iowa. Or they haven't played Iowa yet. And they have Purdue next week. So, you look at some of the schools they have played. Michigan State down rebuilding. Michigan, Washington, both rebuilding. And Nebraska can't really get out of its own way. And, this isn't Indiana's fault. It's just it's the problem with the system of having so many schools, right? And a lot of people would suggest that we should, go back to divisions, right? But that again is inherently set up for failure because what you end up having is with the divisions, like you did in the Big Ten before, where all the good teams are in one division, and then you have an unworthy conference championship game member, right? So thinking about the scheduling, should we really reevaluate that we look at the way conference schedules are made? And so I think going into this year, everybody kind of knew that Michigan and Washington were going to be down. Everybody knew that Michigan State wasn't going to be very good. Is it something where perhaps we should adjust it before the year? Make it a yearly thing. A lot of times these schedules are kind of coming out years in advance. So maybe it's a dynamic thing. Like, all right, look, we need to have you have these projections, right? What teams are projected to win 7 or more games? Every team in the conference should have multiple of these teams on their schedule at least once, right? Or twice. And that way you can say wow, look at Oregon's resume or look at Illinois' resume versus look at Indiana's resume. And so that could be the first step. Second thing is, can we get to a point where we don't need to schedule FCS opponents anymore? If you're a Power 5 school. I have no issue if you're LSU and you want to schedule Louisiana Monroe, Sun Belt team. I think that's okay. That's a regional thing. They're both in Louisiana. Makes sense. But there isn't a ton of reason to bring in Richmond or a team from the FCS that, quite frankly, isn't on the level here for these schools. And it just feels like it's an easy win. Like last week, Clemson played the Citadel. No disrespect to the Citadel, but that's just chalk it up. That's an easy win for Clemson, a nice payday for the Citadel. From the fan watching perspective, it's just not great. And I just find myself Indiana played Western Illinois this year in non-conference. And I just think, wouldn't it have been better, even if it wasn't somebody awesome, if they had played a middling team from the ACC or the Big 12, you would have at least liked if they played West Virginia, like Penn State did, or if they played North Carolina, right, from the ACC. So then at least you could say, well, at least they tried to schedule a good conference schedule or out-of-conference schedule. And I almost wonder, considering there's 4 main conferences now, if you want to have a rotating schedule like they do in the NFL. In the NFL, for the out-of-division games, every team plays their 6 division games every single year, but a lot of times they'll play every single team from a certain division and rotate. So, the Detroit Lions in the NFC North, for example, they drew the AFC South this year, and they played a game against every single member of that conference. Why couldn't it be where, hey, Big Ten has to play the Big 12 this year that in their out of conference. So then each team has to pick 2 or 3 games from that conference, right? I think that would, at the very least, create better early season matchups, create good wins for teams that are kind of rising above the crop. Like if you're using the Big 10, Big 12 example, if you were Indiana and you happened to draw Colorado, Iowa State, Houston, whatever, Baylor, teams in the Big 12 that have had success, then you could look at the resume as like, hey, I played a Big 12 team. I won. I went down there. They came here, whatever. And that way you have a little bit of more momentum than saying, yeah, we hung 77 on Western Illinois, right? It's a different type of conversation, and it's better to watch. Like, nobody wants to watch these blowouts, even if you're a fan of the team. Like, I remember when I lived in Detroit, and Michigan would play like UMass or something, and like they were gonna win by 50. It was just kind of like, it wasn't an entertaining prospect, right? Which is, I think, why the NFL will always be supreme, because we saw last week with like Kansas City and Carolina, even when you think it's an easy win, a lot of times it's not, right? So I think looking into that kind of rotating schedule makes a lot of sense, because right now teams just kind of pick who they want, right? So there's nothing stopping a team from scheduling a couple FCS opponents, or a low-level Sun Belt team just to get an easy win. That school gets a little bit of money for coming up to the bigger school. And I understand it's all about the money or whatever, but, when you consider the media rights deals and everything going on right now with NIL and transfer portal and TV broadcast rights and all that, there's money going around there, right? It's the NCAA and these colleges aren't hurting for money. Let's be real, right? Kind of going back to the basketball analogy. One thing we love in the NCAA tournament is a Cinderella story, right? We love when Florida Gulf Coast is running up and down the floor. We love when Steph Curry came out in Davidson and started doing some things, when Murray State won a couple games, George Mason getting to the Final Four. We love that, right? And because we love the upset, it's like the David versus Goliath thing. Look at this little school. They're just chucking up some threes, and they're beating big bad Kentucky or big bad Kansas. We don't have that in college football. We're so addicted to this idea of merit in college football that we don't even allow ourselves the room to hope for a Cinderella story. Now, we had it a little bit in the bowl era. Like, you'd get the Sugar Bowl, and Hawaii would have a crazy year, and they would make it, and you'd get some people kind of rooting for it. But then at the same time, you would get a lot of people who were kind of rooting for them to get crushed to prove that they were fraudulent. The term frauds and fraudulent gets used a lot in college football. So let's talk about 2 teams specifically who are in the top 25 right now that haven't really played an amazing schedule. And Indiana, we already talked about, and Tulane in the American Conference. When you think of college football, I guarantee you Tulane and Indiana are not 2 teams that you're thinking of. And they would have been, if they both happened to make it in. Boise State kind of qualifies like this a little bit, but Boise has a little bit of an established reputation. They could have been the party crashers, the Cinderella stories. And then, if you were to envision Indiana getting an SEC champion and, really kind of putting them down to the wire, that's fascinating. And if they win, it's awesome, because you end up getting a Cinderella story in the college football playoff. And if they lose, then you say, hey, this team is actually really good is in terms of the powerful SEC team. And they would be embraced in college basketball, but they're not in football, because they're like, oh, they played nobody. They don't have the same athletes and talent as this. And it's almost like in football, we're so transfixed on the domination angle, and kind of totally disregarding the good story angle, which is what Indiana is. They get Kirk Cignetti, a guy who was at James Madison, who had done some really good things, and he takes this Indiana program that's never been good, and all of a sudden they're winning games. That should be exciting. Instead, we're looking to discredit it. And no disrespect to people who are discrediting it and want to see the best team win. But I just think that we should probably be able to lean into this Cinderella story thing a little bit more. Which leads me to just the specter that the SEC has right now. You have to wonder, is there really an SEC bias right now? And I'll be honest, I think there is. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. The first is SEC games are always in prime time. The SEC also added the big time name brand of Oklahoma and Texas. Now, Texas is awesome this year. Oklahoma, not so much, even though they just had a big win over Alabama this past weekend. But you have big names: Auburn, Alabama, LSU, Georgia, Texas, Oklahoma. These are recognizable names, and they play at night. And ESPN has dominated so much of our college football kind of brains over the past few decades. They have the SEC contract, which means we're going to talk about them more. Fox has started to penetrate a little bit. Guess who has that contract for the Big Ten? It's Fox, right? So that's why we focus on those two big conferences. And I think, you got a lot of teams in the SEC that are ranked right now. And you could argue that some of them are overvalued or overrated and that sort of thing. But there is a emphasis on it. Like, a lot of people are talking about South Carolina right now, who have been, had a couple good wins. They beat Iowa. Or, I'm sorry, they beat Texas A&M and they beat Missouri in conference. And those are two teams that have been ranked throughout the year. They lost to LSU, Ole Miss, and Alabama. Teams that were in the national championship conversation from the SEC as well. So I think that does exist a little bit. But to the previous point of fixing schedules and things of that nature, that bias could kind of go away a little bit. I think the reason the bias exists is because there's this thing that SEC fans love their conference. They always talk about how strong this conference is. When Vanderbilt beat Alabama, they were parading that up and down. In the Big Ten, like in the years past when Purdue beat Ohio State or Michigan State upset Michigan, no one was talking about how strong the Big Ten is. They talked about a choke job that a big team had. And that's because there's this culture of, there's really been three schools in the Big Ten over the past few decades that have mattered. And that's Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State. And now that's starting to change with the integration of Oregon. But I think another disappointment has been that Washington, down year after the national championship experience last year, in their first year in the Big Ten, UCLA in a rebuild, USC can't get out of their own way. So all these big schools that came from the Pac-12 outside of Oregon have been a little disappointing, which hasn't helped the perception that the SEC is stronger than the Big Ten. Oklahoma has kind of been okay. They have one big win there. Texas is a national title contention. So, you do have that factor going in the favor of the SEC. But I think what really kind of derailed any sort of idea of the Cinderella story is the BCS era. And there is this BCS system. The college football avoided a playoff, I should say FBS college football. The FCS has had their 16-team playoff for a long time. They avoided the playoff so much because of all this money that was coming into all these bowl games. And when you have all these bowl games and sponsors, there's a resistance, right, to the playoffs. And how are we going to replace that money? Come to find out, quite easily when we look at the way the playoff is shaking out now. But the BCS, it focused so much on merit. And so that's why a team that had a somewhat weaker schedule wasn't given an opportunity to play a game because, this team that lost one time has wins over this, and that team. And it preconditioned us to value merit above all else in college football. It taught us that a 2-loss Alabama was more often than not better than a undefeated Michigan State, for example, right? And this era kind of really got us into this mold, so it gave us no opportunity to like a Cinderella team, right? To like a team that could come out of nowhere and all of a sudden make noise. Even though we've seen it before. We saw Boise State in the Fiesta Bowl beat a dominant Oklahoma team. We've seen this stuff before, but we're so used to defining who's great and digging our heels in the sand into just not accepting anything else because we want the team that we said was great to be great. And if they're not great, then we look foolish. So why would we even entertain the idea of a Cinderella type story? Now, we're at the point of the episode where I'm going to get a little wacky. We talked about scheduling issues before. Why are they scheduling FCS opponents or weaker group of 5 opponents as well? What if we segmented the way that college football at the FBS level was set up? Where the Power 4 are in one bucket and the group of 5 plus the independents in the Pac-12 are in like a second division, right? Sort of like it is in international soccer. We have multiple divisions and stuff, and then where we could introduce a promotion and relegation system. So a thought I had. So your non-conference games are going to have to include Power 4 opponents. If you're going to stick to 3 non-conference, then it would either be 3 from the same conference on the rotating schedule or 1 from each conference, depending. And again, I still think that even a bad Big Ten team versus like a good SEC team would be more entertaining than that same SEC team playing the Citadel or playing Arkansas State or something like that. So like take a team like UCLA. If UCLA, if it was a Big Ten to play the ACC, UCLA played Miami, I think that'd be more fun than them playing a inferior like Florida International or something like that, right? So that's the first thing. Next, the group of 5 plus a Pac-12 will have, through a playoff system, have 4 teams emerge, and those teams will get to play the 4 worst teams in the Power 4. The winner of those games get to stay in the Power 4. The loser, obviously, is relegated to the group of 5 conferences. And by doing this, you're discouraging ineptitude. So you're encouraging the Power 4 teams to spend money and bring in good players. And you're also rewarding the group of 5 schools to get into the next level and have a fair chance to show that they are really that good. And then the winners of these games get to change conferences, so you get a promotion and relegation thing. And that's an added TV opportunity. Think about the NBA and the play-in tournament. Everybody laughed at it at first, but it's been a huge hit. People love the play-in tournament. It gives reason for teams not to tank. It gives reasons to kind of monitor those late season games at the 7, 8, 9, and 10 spots in each conference. I think it's a good way to go. So when you do all this, you kind of ensure that there's no a weak schedule isn't really an issue. Plus, from the group of 5 perspective, when you have a playoff system there, you are able to see some interconference matchups you wouldn't see. You get to see a MAC school play a Conference USA school, or an American school play a Sun Belt school, which you might not see that often because a lot of times these schools are trying to schedule the bigger name schools to get some revenue out of it. So I think it becomes like 2 different types of styles, and you are able then to really get a nice mix, more competitive balance. But like, wrapping all this up is really the genesis of this conversation is about Indiana. So I think there's a case for them to be in the playoff. They're ranked 10th right now. And there's a case for them to be out of the playoff. Let's start with the case for. Ultimately, you're in a Power 4 conference. You play conference opponents. You should be able to, if you're winning a bunch of games, be in consideration for a 12-team playoff. That's the logic, right? The Big Ten is established, the second best conference in the country. And it's not like they, chose which conference opponents to play. It's not Indiana's fault that Michigan State's in the total rebuild. It's not their fault that Washington is having a down year and that Michigan is having a down year. They only played the teams that were in front of them, and they have shown really good improvement. The big knock there is that they didn't look super competitive against Ohio State. Ohio State, of course, is the second-ranked team in the country, and they are, a powerhouse, and they recruit well, so, a lot of teams would get embarrassed by Ohio State. Like, there's no way around that whatsoever. And I think that that's really the case for. It's like they have played the schedule in front of them. That's all you could really ask for. The case against them is that why not schedule somebody better in the non-conference, right? Why not schedule a better quality opponent than Western Illinois? Why not do that, right? And I think if they had scheduled a ACC team or a Big 12 team that, was a little bit more reputable. I think like a Baylor would have been a nice win for them. Baylor right now is like 7 wins. I think the big disparity right now is like when you look at their resume versus everybody else, they have only played one team all year that has won 7 games or more, and that's Ohio State. You start looking up and down, like Clemson at least has played Georgia and Louisville. They lost, but they have a win over a top 25 Pittsburgh team. Depends on how you view that. Boise State has played Oregon close, which matters. That's a good loss. Washington State, they beat UNLV, they've beaten in their conference, and Georgia Southern, who's having a nice year in Conference USA. You look at Arizona State, Texas Tech, Kansas State, and BYU, all good wins, so that's what they're up against. But I think when it comes down to it, they're going to be in, right? They're going to be in because they're a Big Ten team and they only lost 1 game, assuming they don't lose to Purdue. Now, if they lose to Purdue this week, which I don't think is going to happen, but let's just hypothetically say that they do, I think they're out, right? And because you can't produce like the worst team in the Big Ten, you can't lose to Ohio State and have a bad loss on your resume if you're in Indiana. And a lot of people may say this is unfair. And to a degree it is, like if it was Georgia in the same situation where, let's say they lost to LSU and maybe lost to Mississippi State, we would still say, yeah, but they beat some other SEC team. We would give them benefit of the doubt. Or if this was Michigan with the same schedule, we would say, yeah, but it's Michigan, right? There's a prestige thing in college football that I think isn't really there in other sports because everything is subjective and based on opinions, right? So I think that ultimately it's a commentary. Indiana and Tulane and these other schools are a commentary on how we view college football, how we view greatness in the sport. How we're just so obsessed with merit that maybe it makes us disregard some of the better stories out there. And personally, I'm always about the story, so I wish that we would like the story more. But that's the state of college football right now. And I don't know if it's going to change anytime soon. Maybe a 16-team playoff changes things eventually, but it seems like this is going to be the trajectory that we're on for a long time here. All right, guys, that's going to wrap up another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. Until next week, I'm your host, Omar Zaran, Deep Cover Podcast. See you later.